In this discussion, we're going to explore memory. More specifically, we're going to attempt to define, what memory is. Also, we're going to look at the various types of memory. And last but not least, we're going to look at maybe some suggestions for improving our memory. So let's proceed here. First of all, let's begin by defining memory. Memory is a group of related mental processes that are involved in acquiring, storing, and retrieving information. So what is important to understand is these three terms: how we acquire information, how we store that information, and last but not least, how we retrieve that information, how we bring that back up into memory. So we will take a look at that process a little more in depth as we proceed. So memory involves three fundamental processes. There's what's known as encoding, which refers to transforming the information that we take in into a form that can be entered and retained by our memory system. So that is the first stage right there. We encode the information as it comes in. Second, our nervous system works on storing the information. So storage refers to retaining the information in our memory, so we can use that at a later time. So we store that into our brain or nervous system, however you like to think of that. Last but not least, the term retrieval refers to recovering the stored information. Okay, so we will take a look at that, and you will understand that a little more in depth, as we proceed. So as we mentioned earlier, there are three different stages to memory, and those refer to what's known as the stage model of memory. So the first stage is our sensory memory. That basically, refers to our sensory receptors taking in all the information that we are concerned with at the time, and then once it's registered, then it will proceed on to what's known as short-term memory, and that just means the temporary holding of all the information that we're currently thinking about or consciously aware of. So right now, as I'm speaking, you are listening, and you're holding in information that might be shown on various slides or in things that I am saying verbally here. You're holding that in your short-term memory. But our goal is to actually move that into our long-term memory, which refers to the third stage of the model of memory right here. Okay? So long-term memory means basically, an unlimited amount of information and the unlimited amount of time that it can be stored. We will look at that a little bit more in depth as we proceed here. So, first of all, the first stage we looked at earlier was called sensory memory. So basically, we just have to be aware that, our sensory receptors, they're constantly taking in information, which is, auditory type information, visual information, verbal information, just information that we're taking in, through reading or watching videos, that type of thing. They're still in the form of visual and or auditory information. But what's important to understand from here is, is this refers to as our sensory memory. And sensory memory does not last forever because it would just be too much. We're taking in so much sensory information from minute to minute throughout our day that it's just, it's too much to hold in and be concerned with. we're usually only focused on the type of sensory information that is most pertinent and important to us at the any given point of time. So just keep that in mind here, okay? So as I mentioned earlier, there are two types of sensory memory. There's what's known as visual memory, okay? And that's also called, because visual is visual type of information, it's also known as iconic memory. Okay, icons, visual type formations. Okay, and what's most important to know on this is visual memory is very short-lived. It usually lasts, between a quarter to a half of a second. Okay, so because we are bombarded with so much visual information constantly coming in throughout the day that we have to move on basically. Okay, auditory information, which is sound, is also known as echoic memory or echo. Basically, it comes from the word echo, meaning a brief memory that is like an echo. And that lasts a little bit longer than visual information. And so that can last up to 3 or 4 seconds. A lot of you may be surprised to actually learn that. A lot of my students actually, write about that in the discussion forums. Okay, so now we're going to begin talking about our short-term working memory. Now, what's kind of important to understand about this is short-term, right here, also is the same thing as what's known as our working memory. So right now, as you were listening to me, explain this, and you're looking at this video right here, you're using your short-term or your working memory to process this information. Now, as we hold this, longer than about 20 seconds, then we can move on to the next kind of memory. But short-term working memory usually is basically stored or processed in our brain, about 20 seconds or so. Okay. Now, I put in a couple of notes here, and please remember, that what I put in red font right here, that is what's most important, what I feel is most important to remember about this. And you can kind of forget about the rest of this here once, you've read through this. It's really hard to retain every single word of this. But what's important to know is our short-term memory usually lasts about 20 seconds. Okay. But sometimes we need to hold a memory longer than 20 seconds. And so we'll find ourselves repeating something over and over, so we don't forget it, so we can hold that. Like take, for instance, someone tells you their phone number, but you didn't enter it in your phone right away. So on your way home, you might keep repeating it to yourself over and over. Well, that is what's called as known and is called maintenance rehearsal. That's basically mental or verbal repetition of information. Okay, so just keep that in mind. That is a valid way to hold something in our memory for an extended period of time. Another thing that I put here is, well, so in our short-term memory, how much can we remember? You know what I mean? How much can we process? And so the first researcher that looked at this said, well, the magical number, of items of information that we can remember and process in our short-term memory is basically 7 items plus or minus 2. So like that could be 7 numbers which take for instance, I just would like to bring your attention to that fact is, the basic phone number is 7 numbers, not including like an area code or something like that, but just something to think about. So in red here, I said, but you can increase your capacity for basically remembering information by using the term in the process known as chunking. We're going to take a look at that in just a little while. Also, we can use maintenance rehearsal to help us encode information into our brain. So those are the most important things. Now, current researchers, though, they've kind of suggested that basically the true magic number, what we can really encode at any given time, is basically 4 amounts of information, which can be numbers or anything, plus or minus 1 when we're not able to chunk. So just something to keep in mind here. Let's move on. Okay, so remember, short-term memory, was the second basic phase of the model, that we discussed earlier. Now we're interested in moving from short-term memory or working memory, basically, let me back up here. What's important to know on this is basically working and short-term memory are basically the same thing. They're terms that are used interchangeably. Okay, but an important thing to remember from this, though, is, working memory is what you're doing right now as you're looking at this video and listening to me speak, and you're thinking about this. That's basically your working memory. Active, conscious manipulation. And so that can be temporarily stored, but it can't be stored in your long-term memory unless you actually stop and actually go over this information for an extended period of time and a lot of repetition. Okay, so now that brings us to our discussion about long-term memory. Basically, in red here, I said long-term memory refers to information that is stored longer than the 20-second duration of short-term memory. Now, what's important, though, to keep in mind, is, that also will require, some repetition to actually hold it into the long-term memory. Now, it can, this refers to right here as being encoded in long-term memory. So longer than 20 seconds of duration can move from working memory into long-term memory. Okay, but in order to be retrieved at a later date and be stored for an indefinite period of time, we'll need some repetition. So I just wanted to bring your attention to that. So long-term memory has different memory systems, which we will discuss. Long-term memory also can last a lifetime. It's unlimited in the amount of time. And then the amount of information that can be held is limitless as well. So encoding long-term memory is this is what's important, and this is what's very important to you as a student that is attempting to encode and retrieve information from your classes and use these, hopefully for the rest of your life, or at the very least, remember information, for exams and things like that. So I just want to bring your attention to the fact that maintenance rehearsal, remember, maintenance rehearsal means basically just repeating something over and over. Well, that has been found, to be minimally effective. Okay, right there. It's minimally effective. Okay, I put that in parentheses because, originally I put not effective, but really it's just minimally effective. Okay. But there's a certain type of rehearsal that is found to be much more effective, and that's what's known as elaborative rehearsal. Okay, so elaborative rehearsal is basically what I'm doing. So as I uh, introduce you to a new term, then I start to elaborate on it. I start to give examples. Well, that's what's called elaborative rehearsal. I start elaborating upon the information. And that has been found to be much more effective in encoding information into our long-term memory. Okay, so please stop here, and look at the information, really get this in your mind and get this in your memory. And then when you're ready, you'll move on. Okay, so right here, I put this in here because I feel that this is one of the most important things that you can remember, no pun intended, since we are studying memory here, but as a student, and is what is the best way to study in order to encode information into your long-term memory? Well, I put a few things to think about right here. Okay, number one, make sure you understand the new information by basically restating it in your own words. So don't just try to memorize definitions or information, but be able to say it in your own way. Often you've heard of the idea that, well, you truly know something if you're able to explain it to somebody else. Well, that's basically, another way of saying what I said here. Okay, so let's move on with number 2 right here. So actively question the new information. Come up with questions, like, well, why is that true? How does that relate to my personal experience? Have I found that that is true in regard to my experience? Okay. Let's move on to number 3. So think about the potential applications and implications of the material. So basically, how can I use this? How does this apply to my life? Or at the very least, how does that apply to, my success in this class? All right. Next item right here. Relate the new material to information you already know. That is extremely important. If you can connect incoming new material to information that you already know, it'll help you to encode that into your long-term memory much more efficiently and strongly. Last but not least, generate your own examples of the concept, especially examples from your own experiences. Well, right there, that means being able to elaborate and elaborate in a special way by basically by generating your own examples from your own experience. That way you're really connecting all the incoming information as it applies to you, and you're taking the information further than just the raw material that's usually shown in a textbook. So this right here is what I feel is the most important one of the most important things to take with you from this point on. Okay, so let's move forward. So there are 3 types of information in our long-term memory, basically 3 categories. Number 1, procedural memory. That is how to perform different skills. Okay, you see how I put these in red right here. Procedural means how to perform different skills. Also, that's sometimes known as muscle memory. Okay, so that usually comes automatic. That goes into our automatic memory, and that can be things like basically everything, like walking, holding a fork, how to play the piano, how to do any type of skill. That is known as procedural memory. Okay, I just want to bring your attention, see how I elaborated upon that? That's what you need to do, is come up with your own examples and your own elaborations. That'll help you memorize this much better. Okay, the second type of information is episodic. Episodic refers to memory of specific events or episodes. So basically including the time and place. That can be, also autobiographical memory, our personal life history. So basically, anytime that you remember anything that has to do with a specific event or an episode, that refers to episodic memory. The third type of information in our long-term memory is semantic memory. And that is knowledge of facts, names, definitions, concepts. Okay, now why that's important to you is that is the type of memory that you're most, I would say, most concerned with, and you spend most of your time as a student with. Semantic memory is remembering knowledge of our facts, names, definitions, and concepts, which is exactly what you do in the majority of your classes. Let's move on. So the two systems of long-term memory, just want to, some of this is going to be a little bit of review, and some of this will be, hooking new information to that information that you previously learned. So first of all, explicit memory, it's also known as declarative memory, is memory with awareness. So what does that mean? Well, basically all that means is the information or knowledge that we can consciously recall or recollect. Okay, so that's why that's called, right here they use the term consciously. Basically, you're able to declare your memory. You go, oh yeah, I remember that because, blah, 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 blah. Well, that is declaring your memory. Okay, so the two types of explicit memory are episodic and semantic. I won't go over those again. We talked about those in previous slides. So moving forward. The second type of memory right here, long-term memory, is what's called implicit. That is non-declarative memory. Okay, that's memory without awareness. Okay, so that is all the information or knowledge that we remember, basically, task-oriented, but we do it automatically. Things like walking, eating, with a utensil, any type of motor skill. Once we get that into our muscle memory or something, that is implicit memory. All right, let's move forward here. So how do we organize information into our long-term memory? One method is what we know as clustering. And that's basically when we put related items together. And we will actually practice those in the next slide here. So basically, if we're trying to memorize, a long list of items, we try to put those we cluster those into categories. So here's an example, okay? Right here, if we took a look at this, we go, oh, wow, that's a lot of items to remember. I don't know if I can do that. But if we cluster those into categories, we have a much easier time and much better chance at remembering these. Take, for instance, we look at this and we go, okay, well, there's types of furniture like chair, footstool, a bed, let's see here, a lamp, etc., sofa. Well, then we can actually cluster those and remember each category, work on memorizing each category. We say, okay, well, there's this many items available in the category of furniture, and et cetera, et cetera. So I hope that helps. I hope that makes sense. Okay. And then one thing that helps us to remember, basically I'll use that term very loosely, but remember things is what's known as retrieval cues. So things like a retrieval cue can be anything. That can be a quick note that one jots to oneself, that one puts on there. It can also, have you ever seen someone that basically ties a string around their finger or snaps a rubber band around their wrist, to remember something? Well, that is known as a retrieval cue. Okay, so basically when we forget something, that's the inability to retrieve. Okay. Okay, so, but what retrieval, remember, that's the process of accessing and retrieving stored information that happens to be in our long-term memory. So a retrieval cue is a clue, a prompt, or a hint that can help trigger the recall of a stored memory. Hope that helps. All right. Now, every once in a while, this happens to all of us. As a matter of fact, this happens to most of us, more often than we are aware of. This is known as the tip of the tongue experience. That means we basically will have the sensation of knowing something, but we just cannot retrieve it. We say, boy, it's right on the tip of my tongue, but I just cannot say it. Well, researchers have discovered that basically people have about one tip of the tongue experience per week. That's an average, a broad generalization. Okay. All right, so we're going to move on to what's known as the serial position effect. That involves basically the tendency to remember items either at the beginning or the end of a list better than the items in the middle. It doesn't have to be a list, though. For those of you who have been to a concert or an event or something, we tend to remember basically, the opening part of the event, like the first song or two at a concert. And we happen to remember the last songs, that were performed in the concert. But we cannot remember, what happened in the middle of the concert. Well, that's what's known as the serial position effect. So when we tend to remember the first items or the first parts of an event, that is called the primacy effect. So just want to help you to remember here, I use these as retrieval cues, actually. The primacy effect and the recall, the first items, those are both in red. You can hook those together, and those will help encode that information, and you'll be able to retrieve that a lot better. So primacy effect is our ability to recall the first items better. Now, the ability to recall the final items, that is what's known as the recency effect. So connect those. Recency effect is the final items in a list or an event. Okay, now this is a term right here. Basically, even though it sounds a little bit, complicated, it's really not. They use the term, researchers use the term encoding specificity principle. Okay, all that refers to is basically when conditions of retrieval are similar to conditions of encoding. And so when that is true, then our retrieval is more likely to be successful. So basically that just means when we are in a situation, we are more likely to remember it if we happen to be in a situation that is really similar to the situations when we first encoded the information. So basically, there are two types right here that they talk about. So that refers to context effects. And that means, basically, we tend to remember information more easily when retrieval occurs in the same setting in which you originally learned the information. So I'm going to give you an example here, okay? Take, for instance, you always do your psychology studies at a certain computer, at a certain day, at a certain time, and in a certain room. Well, if you keep doing that in that context, that will actually help you to remember, access retrieval a lot more efficiently. So that is known as context effects. All right. Now, mood congruence refers to the exact same thing, but basically when your mood is similar. And basically, I will use the example of the more likely that you are in the same mood as when you encode in the information, that will help you to, retrieve the information a lot quicker, a lot better, a lot more efficiently. All right. So moving forward here, we're going to look at what's known as flashbulb memories. Those are the kind of memories where they are very sudden, and they usually are when something very suddenly happens to you, and you will tend to encode the information. At least, you think you encode it very efficiently, and it's a very strong, good memory. And so, I put in a definition right here, so basically these memories, flashbulb memories, are thought to involve the recall of very specific details or images surrounding a significant, rare, or a vivid event. So that can be anything like memories of a wedding or a graduation or, anything that is important to you. And it can be, a positive or a negative experience. So basically, pause the video here, take a look at this, and look at these questions right along here. Just kind of, just see what you think about this. And we are going to move forward. All right. So right here, we're going to start taking a look at forgetting. Now, remember, forgetting just basically refers to the inability to retrieve information. So this researcher right here, Ebbinghaus, he came up with the term the forgetting curve. So he basically proposed that much of what of what is forgotten is lost relatively soon after we originally learned it. And second, how quickly we forget material depends on how well the material was encoded in the first place. So how meaningful the material was and how often it was rehearsed. So that is extremely important, and that's why I put it in red here. So please pause and spend some time with this information. And then we're going to take a look at a chart right here. That's called the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. And as you can see right here, here's 100% of the incoming information, but it is quickly forgotten all the way down to below 40% right here, with it like almost immediately. So we tend to forget over 60% of the information that we learn immediately. And then, a couple hours later, if not practiced and done with some repetition, everything, then basically our memory goes to 30% of the incoming information. And then basically 6 hours later, right here, if we start at 6 hours right here and we go straight up, we can see that it's under 30%. And then we can see that it basically just declines. So that is why it's important, to, constantly review new information on a regular basis, so we can ensure that we will retain the information. So that's why I constantly say, that you need to look at, videos, study guides, and things of that nature more than one time, because it's exactly because of this. Because without revisiting the information over an extended period of time, we experience a constant downward curve about how much information we can retain. Okay, so why do we forget? So one of the most common reasons for forgetting occurs, and of course I put this in red because this is very important, when information is not encoded initially into our long-term memory. Okay, that's called encoding failure. All right. So, and then another term right here is what's called prospective memory. That is refers to memory of what needs to be done in the future. So basically, whenever you say to yourself, "Oh, I have to remember to, make a initial post in the discussion forum tonight," that is called prospective memory. Trying to remember something that needs to be done in the future. Okay, another reason why we forget, well, that's called, another reason is known as decay theory. Okay, so when a new memory is formed, it creates a structural change or a chemical change in our brain. Okay, so I underline that. That's very important. Structural and chemical changes occur in the brain. Well, over a period of time, memory traces, basically, they fade away over time, as a matter of normal brain processes. So basically, those structural or chemical changes that occur in our brain, over a period of time, they tend to decay. That is another reason why we tend to forget information over a long period of time if it's not revisited, repracticed, or basically remembered. All right. Another reason we'll tend to forget things is what's known as interference theory. Interference theory basically refers to memories interfering with other memories. So, that refers to, not, memory loss, because of passage of time, but that's actually refers to memories that compete with each other or even replace each other. So have you ever experienced, the effect, or caught yourself saying this, "Oh no, why did you say that? Now I can't remember, what I was thinking." Well, that refers to interference theory, that the fact that what someone said or what you heard is interfering with a memory that you already had, basically stored. And there are two types of interference right here. There's what's known as retroactive interference, and that basically just refers to a new memory interferes with old memory. That's what I just mentioned earlier. Okay, but there's also what's called proactive interference, and that basically refers to the scenario when an old memory interferes with new information. Okay, sorry about the pause there. I had to actually shut my door because there was some interference coming in. So let's carry on. So I was talking about proactive interference, and that refers to an old memory interfering with new incoming information. Okay? All right. So let's move forward here. Another reason we forget is what's called motivated forgetting. So basically, we will suppress or repress an undesired memory. So suppression means consciously forgetting information. So an example of that is when one will experience something and they'll say, "Oh, that was a terrible situation, and I do not want to remember that." So consciously forgetting refers to suppression. Now, unconsciously forgetting, that is what's known as repression. So that refers to the scenario when one cannot remember something because it was too traumatic to remember. And as a defense mechanism, a person does not remember something that happened, a traumatic occurrence. So please take a moment and just kind of understand and maybe come up with your own examples of those two right there. Moving forward. So one thing that's important to understand is memories are imperfect. Details can change over time. They can be, without awareness, details can be added, subtracted, exaggerated, downplayed over an extended period of time. So just keep that in mind. Also, the misinformation effect. So basically, after an event, a person's recollection of an original event can be distorted. Okay, that just means, the person just might not be remembering correctly. Source confusion refers to basically not remembering accurately the source of the original memory. Okay, and so that is important to remember. We will move on. Elaborate just a little bit. So as I mentioned, source confusion, that arises when the true source of the memory is forgotten, or when a memory is attributed to the wrong source. So that can result in false memories. Okay. All right. And definitely imagining an event, one that even never took place, can help create a memory. Okay, so that is very important to know, to understand, and to remember. So I put a little chart right here that repeatedly imagining an event makes an event seem increasingly familiar. Then the next step is, coupled with a sense of increased familiarity, people experience source confusion. And the more vivid, the last, basic step of this is, the more vivid and detailed the imaginative experience, the more likely it is that people will confuse the imagined event with a real occurrence. So that is an example of what people tend to call a false memory. So that is how that occurs. And I am not going to go over all these, but here are a lot of factors how false memories can occur. All right, so I highly recommend you pause the video here, take a look at these, become familiar with these. All right, another type of forgetting here is what's known as amnesia. So amnesia there are a couple different types here. Amnesia is basically severe memory loss. Okay, and there are two types of amnesia. Retrograde amnesia is the inability to remember past information. Okay, usually occurs, like it's real common, like after a head injury or something. Okay, on the other hand, there's what's this term right here, what's known as anterograde amnesia. And that refers to the inability to form new memories. And that means, more often than not, it may refer to hippocampal damage. So you'll remember, the hippocampus is a structure of the brain that is very important for encoding new memories. Okay, and then there's this term right here, memory consolidation. Now, basically, all that refers to is basically gradually consolidating, converting new long-term memories into stable, enduring memory codes. Okay, I'm not going to go any further with that. It's just something that's important to memorize. Now, I put this picture in here just because, definitely, head injury can be a very strong factor in memory type issues. Those who experience degradation of memory ability. Okay, so take for instance, that happens in sports quite often. Other types of head injuries, due to car accidents or things like fighting sports where one acquires head injury due to repeated blows to the head, that type of thing. Just some examples. All right, so last but not least here, we're going to take a very quick look here at the parts of the brain that are involved in memory. So as you can see, basically all of the brain is very involved in memory, the three phases of memory. Okay, so the prefrontal cortex, is right here. Okay, I'm not going to go over these in extreme detail, so it's up to you to pause the video and just become familiar with these. Okay, the amygdala right here, that is involved in the emotional aspects of memories. The medial temporal lobe, which is underneath here, the lower lobe here, that encodes and transfers new explicit memories to long-term memory. Then we have our hippocampus. That encodes and transfers the new explicit memories to long-term memory as well. And last but not least here, we have the cerebellum, this structure right here at the very back and underneath part of our brain. That involves memories that have to do with movement, muscle memory, that type of thing. So please become very familiar with that. And that concludes our discussion about memory. Now, I just want to remind you that the next step is please get out your study guide for this chapter. Start to answer the questions to the best of your ability. And if you do not, if you cannot answer questions, some certain questions, definitely refer to your textbooks and also this video. So I will see you online. Keep up your good work.